There are many different types of critical reasoning question. Consequently, it's very important that you learn to recognize the key words in the question that give you a clue as to what the question is actually looking for. For example, there are two types of conclusion questions. The first type being the kind where the question wants you to find the conclusion that already exists in the argument. So the question will say something like, which of the following states the conclusion of the argument? The other kind of conclusion question is where the argument doesn't have a conclusion yet. So the question is asking you what would be a reasonable conclusion based on the information that already exists in the passage. These types of conclusion questions may ask what can be properly inferred, or what must also be true, or the passage supports which of the following. Again, these questions are asking you to choose a conclusion that doesn't yet exist in the passage. And one of the clues that there is not a conclusion in the passage yet is that the question will not refer to the passage as an argument. Instead, the question will refer to the passage simply as information, or statements, or simply the passage. Almost every other type of question will refer to the passage as an argument, because arguments have opinions or conclusions. We will discuss conclusion questions in a lot more detail in another video, but for now just remember that when they ask you to choose your own conclusion, softer, more general language is usually better. Discrepancy questions are questions that introduce a situation that has a normal, predictable outcome, but the outcome is not what you would expect. Your job is to choose an answer that explains why the outcome is not what you would normally expect. Obviously, you could recognize a discrepancy question if the question has the word discrepancy in it. Other keywords include resolve, explain, phenomenon, and paradox. If a question wants you to identify the bad reasoning in an argument, they may ask you, where is the argument vulnerable to criticism? Or what is the main flaw in the argument? In these cases, they're usually asking you to identify what's known as a common fallacy. And again, we'll discuss these question types in more detail in the common fallacies video. Assumption questions ask you to identify what the author already assumes is true when he's making the argument. As you'll see in the assumptions video, the easiest way to approach these questions is to actually negate or reverse each answer choice and then decide which answer choice weakens the argument the most when it's negated. Obviously, the word assumption is going to be a key word to identify an assumption question. But phrases like the argument requires or the conclusion is based on and depends, these also signify assumption questions. These types of assumption questions are asking you to identify what must be true in order for the argument to be true. In formal logic, we often call these questions necessary assumptions. There's another type of assumption question which is known as a sufficient assumption, which means the question is asking for something that doesn't have to be true, it's not necessary, but if it is true, it is sufficient to prove the argument. Phrases like justify the argument, or the conclusion follows logically, or the argument must be true if, or the conclusion is properly drawn if, all signify a sufficient assumption question. With sufficient assumption questions, you want your language in the answer choice to be as strong as possible. Frequently, the correct answer choice will have a word that is very extreme, such as all, or every, or only, or none. Again, with sufficient assumption questions, you often want to choose the most strongly worded answer choice. A question that wants you to choose an answer that reinforces the author's line of reasoning will either ask you to strengthen or support the author. In these kinds of questions, you're usually reinforcing a suppressed premise or confirming a logical fallacy. If a question asks you to weaken or provide evidence against or undermine the author's position, then the correct answer will have something that exposes the logical fallacy or proves that the suppressed premise is not accurate. If a question asks you to consider the formal logic or the mathematical structure of the argument, then the question will ask about the pattern of reasoning or ask you to choose a reasoning that is most similar. Again, we'll visit this in greater detail in the formal logic video. When you watch the videos on conclusions and premises and supporting and weakening arguments, you'll notice we pay a lot of attention to how soft or strong a particular answer choice is. Generally speaking, when we're talking about a conclusion, a softer conclusion is better. And when we're talking about a reason, we want strong reasons. So it's very important to distinguish whether a question is asking us for a reason or a conclusion, because it changes the strength of the preferred answer choice. This can get a little bit tricky when the question uses the word supports, because you will have both conclusion and reason questions that use the word supports. If the question is asking which of the following supports the argument, the question is asking you to find a reason why the argument is true. If we flip the order, however, and the question asks you about what the passage supports, then the question is asking you to choose an appropriate conclusion. And again, one of the clues is that in the conclusion question, the question will refer to the passage as a passage as opposed to an argument. If something is an argument, it has a conclusion. If we refer to the passage as the passage or the information, and we avoid using the word argument, the question is likely suggesting that the passage doesn't yet have a conclusion, so your job is to choose the best conclusion.